Thank you. So I don't have any slides, so no need to look at the screen. But what I thought I'd do is I'd show what the promise of the internet and the global connectivity is by doing this. So I just turned on my irrigation system at home in Tampa, Florida, probably 7,000 kilometers away in the middle of the night. And I did it with a phone app that I just pressed a button. And so the challenge we have is this digital infrastructure that we've built is global. It's attached everywhere. I signed on to the Wi-Fi code here. I've never been to this building before, and I was just able to run my irrigation system. And I can assure you that the security of my irrigation system is very low, right? The system that I bought from a very small company, they have 4 developers. They literally built the system in their garage, and they were able to make it work. And what they were building as their innovation was something that provided functionality. When I spoke to them on the phone, right, they said, security? Well, yeah, we're using this standard stack. I'm like, well, what stack are you using? We're using this particular Linux stack. Well, when did you update it? Update it? What do you mean? Right, so I had this dialogue with them about the system, and it's a very elegant application for me as a consumer. And I will tell you, at my home network, it is partitioned off from the other things in my house, right, because I'm a security expert. But I'm certain if my parents had this at their house, they would just plug it into their internet service, and they wouldn't think twice about it. About a year and a half ago, maybe 2 years ago, there was a big vulnerability in its software system. And it had been in the software code for 20 years. Right? And I was explaining to executive management at DTCC where I was working, that's why your TiVo rebooted last night, is because they applied an update to fix this vulnerability that was introduced in a shell called Bash. It's another Linux system, or Unix system, I should say. The vulnerability was accidentally introduced in 1994. It was discovered in 2014, right? So we're building systems and deploying them using technology, in some cases that is multiple decades old, that we think is brand new. And we haven't understood the implications of that. Now, my irrigation system, my TiVo, they're not how we run society. Those are benefits we get, things that are conveniences. But those same things exist in the underlying infrastructures that keep the lights on, the planes flying, the trains running, right? And so the challenge that I see when we look at this space is that we've created this divergence between how we use functionality and how we get benefits without fully accounting the costs. And the analogy I've used, it's sort of like take a car. So I drive a lot. You have to maintain a vehicle. You have to change the oil. And if you drive a car for 100,000 kilometers and the engine seizes, and you take it to your mechanic and say, hey, what happened? And they ask you, when's the last time you changed the oil? And if your answer is, well, don't they put that in at the factory? Right? There's a problem. We have that sort of maintenance habit as a society about our use of technology. It's become disposable. It's the things we use. We move from device to device. But the things that persist, we don't really maintain. And if you're a cyber attacker, that's gold. That's how you actually infiltrate infrastructures, by the things that are improperly maintained because they didn't know it. There are other priorities. And somebody mentioned earlier the sort of difference between when the attackers operate and when the defenders operate. And there's a company called FireEye. They do a study every year about the intrusions they investigate. And they found the median time from when an intrusion occurred to when a defender noticed was 205 days. Right? So imagine if a burglar's in your house for 205 days. They're going to find everything of value, right? And we have the same problem in the cyberspace. And so what we really need to do is we need to figure out how do we shorten that time and how do we increase our ability to detect. In the same study, they noted that 2/3 of the victims of these intrusions found out about them because someone else told them. They didn't know on their own. All right, so 2 out of 3 times we didn't know it happened. And when we figured out it had already happened, 8 months ago, all right, we've got a huge issue we've got to work through. And so one of the reasons we've been advocating so strongly on information sharing is it's one of the tools we have to understand what's happening, and it allows us to tackle some of the underlying economic challenges in cybercrime. And so let me give a small analogy. So the controls or the compliance argument is almost always about building high walls. So think of the medieval castle, right? So we've built this structure. We have the high walls. Those are our controls that prevent things from happening. But we have to realize who we're facing as an adversary. Medieval castles were very good prior to gunpowder. They were very good prior to paratroopers, right? And so we've been building our digital castles with high walls and not realizing that our adversaries are coming in as an airborne drop, and they're flying in over the walls. And so we have to change our thinking. And so if you look at the way you defend an infrastructure, yes, you need to have high walls and good controls and make sure all the doors and windows are locked, right? But you also have to know who you're facing as an adversary and how they're going about their business. And so information sharing is the way that you do that, right? There was a slide earlier. There's a common standard that was developed. It's being managed by a group called Oasis now. And it's a technical standard that describes threats in a way that a machine can process it and a human can understand it. And the reason this is important is we need to shrink that 205 days down. And if we can use standardization, I can tell you when something happens to me, and now you know what to look for, or you know what to put in place for a countermeasure based on the data that I share, right? And that sharing mechanism is very important. The other component of it is people are hesitant to share. And you know, the NIS directive and the incident reporting, I think Jan's points are good, which is what's the objective? Are we trying to protect consumers, tell them to take an action? Are we trying to inform investors who know about the risks of companies they're invested in? Or are we trying to defend other infrastructures, right? And when I read the NIS and work through some of the iterations that have occurred, those questions to me are still unclear as to what is the primary objective. And if you can define the primary objective, then you can design the regimen and the method by which it needs to be reported. But if you're trying to muddle through all three, I can guarantee you will not get reporting that achieves either of the objectives, right? Whichever one you select, or even if you have multiple regimes for multiple objectives. So the information sharing is essentially the nexus of understanding as to what threats you face. There's also an earlier comment about being risk-based. So my prior role, I was the Chief Information Security Officer at DTCC, which is Financial Market Infrastructure. We have a very different risk profile than a retail bank or a cloud infrastructure or a government entity. We face the same four types of adversaries, to use Jan's breakout, right? We see cyber criminals, we see economic espionage, maybe we see military espionage, although it's generally incidental. Like we have military reservists who work for us and they get targeted at their work email address. And of course we see these other conflict-related activities. But the mix of those adversaries that a DTCC face are different than the mix that your companies would face. And so if we have a single static framework that makes one assumption about the threat, it may work for the one model institution, but it probably doesn't work for all the others. And so the challenge as we build policy in this space is how do we create it that's both reflective of the needs of society, but also dynamic enough to adjust with the problem set, right? And I think that's one of our big challenges. And so this notion of active defense, right, of being nimble to respond to the threats that you face is one that we have to keep up because the nature of the threats change at the pace the nature of the technologies change, right? I mean, I don't know the last time I used a VHS tape. In my, I think I still have one. I'm all on DVR technology now. I've moved my personal technology around. But if I go and look at the body of laws that exist in that type of technology, they're almost written for the days when you went to a store and rented a tape and brought it home. I don't know many people who do that now, right? And so we have to figure out, as we build policy, how the policy can move at the same speed of the technology, which means it has to be flexible, it has to be adjustable. And the last point I wanted to cover is, in my personal opinion, the nature of innovation is creative destruction. And so if you take a service, whether you like it or not, like Uber, well, what is Uber really doing? It's coming up with a different way to provide transportation services than the classic frameworks that were built. And I think we can all see very clearly that type of disruptive model does not fit into a static regulatory framework that made assumptions about how transport was delivered, right? Good or bad, you don't have to like it, or if you can love it, it doesn't really matter. But just the nature of that challenge as we look at financial innovation and technology innovation, when it intersects with policy, we have to figure out the balance between being pro-growth and letting new things happen and see how they play out, and then adjusting to them from a policy perspective as being prescriptive and saying things are going to work this way. And in take cybersecurity as the apex example of that. Is this space is so dynamic that I am certain the 8 or 12-month process to issue a final rule after a 3-year process to build a rule after a 5-year deliberative process to steer it, whatever we write is going to be obsolete the minute the ink is dry or the toner is fixed or the electrons are emailed. And so my one piece of advice as we look at this process in the policy side is recognize the rapid changing pace of the things we're trying to control through policy and have a light touch, right? The challenge of having a very structured, rigid framework against a very dynamic problem means you have a lot of discontinuity and a lot of mismatch. And that's the one main thought I want to leave you with. So thank you.